The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with something that felt almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that didn't bring peace but instead carried an unshakable weight, pressing into the walls, settling into every breath, coiling around every unsaid word. A silence that existed only in moments like this, when something final, something irreversible, was about to happen. And at the center of it all sat Keanu Reeves. Not the Hollywood legend. Not the man the world knew. But a man stripped of everything but this moment, a man fighting for the only thing he had left. His hands were steady, resting in his lap, his fingers wrapped tightly around a single strip of worn leather, the leash that tethered him to Shadow, the only being in the world that still made sense. The German shepherd sat beside him, poised and unmoving, his body rigid with the kind of trained discipline that never truly left. His ears flicked at the smallest of sounds, his sharp eyes scanning the room, watching, waiting. To everyone else, Shadow was just a military asset, an animal trained for war, programmed to obey. A tool. A weapon. But to Keanu, Shadow was something else entirely. His partner. His protector. The only constant in a life that had been rewritten, erased, broken, and rebuilt too many times to count. And now, they wanted to take him away. Keanu inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured. He had spent years perfecting that kind of restraint. The ability to remain still when everything inside him was screaming. The ability to suppress the fire burning beneath his skin. But today, it was different. Today, that fire refused to be ignored. The judge sat high above, his expression unreadable, his hands resting over the documents that held Keanu's future in black and white ink. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of a man who had already made his decision. This is your final opportunity to make your case, Mr. Reeves. The military has deemed Shadow to be government property. He is to be reassigned. You may speak now, but the ruling will be final. Final. The word dug into Keanu's ribs, cut through something deep inside him. He gripped the leash a little tighter. His jaw clenched. His pulse remained steady, but his chest felt tighter, his lungs working harder to pull in air that suddenly felt thinner. He had walked away from this world. From the lies. From the life they had built him for, the identity they had carved into his bones. He had escaped. Or so he thought. But the truth was, they had never really let him go. And now, they wanted more. They wanted the last part of him, the one thing he had left. He lifted his gaze, his voice low but unwavering. Your Honor, he began, slow, deliberate, every word carrying the weight of something unspoken, something too heavy to name. Shadow isn't just a military asset. He's not a tool. Not something you can reassign, discard, pretend never existed. His fingers curled tighter around the leash. He saved my life. Not once. Not twice. More times than I can count. There was a shift in the air. A ripple in the courtroom, almost imperceptible. People leaned in ever so slightly, their focus shifting. Keanu felt it but didn't acknowledge it. He just kept speaking, his voice steady, unwavering. On the battlefield, Shadow was there. He pulled me from burning wreckage. He shielded me from gunfire. He sensed threats before I even knew they were there. He exhaled sharply, his throat burning. And when the war was over, when the orders stopped, when the missions ended, Shadow was still there. Keanu looked down for the briefest of moments, his gaze landing on the dog beside him. Shadow didn't move, but Keanu could feel it, the unspoken understanding between them, the silent language built through years of trust, of life and death, of survival. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper now. When I came home, when the silence was too much, when the nights were too long, when I couldn't close my eyes without seeing ghosts, Shadow was the only thing that kept me breathing. The silence in the room deepened. Thickened. The judge's face remained unreadable, but Keanu could feel it now, the weight of the truth settling over everyone in that room. But before the judge could speak, before anyone could process the moment, Shadow moved. At first, it was just a subtle shift, a flick of an ear, a tensing of muscle. Then, he stood. His body went rigid. His head snapped toward the entrance of the courtroom. And then a single, sharp bark. The sound shattered the silence. Cut through the air like a bullet. Keanu's pulse spiked. His breath caught. That wasn't a bark. That was a warning. His fingers flexed around the leash, muscles coiling with something sharp, old, instinctual. He knew that sound. He had heard it before. On the battlefield. Before the explosion. Before the gunfire. Before the kill. His throat went dry. "Shadow," he murmured, his voice low, calm, but inside, he was anything but calm. The murmurs in the courtroom grew. People shifted. Confused whispers filled the space. The bailiffs glanced at each other, uneasy now, hands inching toward their weapons. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone muttered. Keanu didn't blink. Didn't turn. Didn't breathe. "He only does this," he said, voice slow, measured, every syllable laced with something cold and sharp, "when there's danger." The judge faltered. And then, the doors creaked. The sound was small, barely perceptible. But Keanu heard it. He felt it. The weight in the air shifted. The atmosphere changed. Something was wrong. His entire body went still. Then another sound. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Shadow growled. Low. Guttural. Dangerous. A sound that did not belong in a courtroom. A sound that belonged in combat, on the front lines, in places where men died and silence meant survival. The bailiffs reacted instantly, hands now resting fully on their weapons, but they didn't move. No one did. Another footstep. Then, the doors burst open. The man who stepped inside was tall. Clothed in black. Hood pulled low. His face was obscured, but it wasn't just his presence that set off something dark and primal inside Keanu. It was the way he moved. Controlled. Precise. The way his shoulders remained loose, unhurried, as if the room, the people, the tension, it all meant nothing. The way he carried himself, the way his boots hit the polished floor, the way his presence alone made every muscle in Keanu's body tighten like a wound wire. And then, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Keanu's breath stopped. That smile. He knew that smile. It was buried deep beneath years of silence, tucked into the fractures of memories that had been stolen, rewritten, erased. But it was there. A ghost of something once known. A shadow in the back of his mind, just out of reach. Shadow barked again, desperate now, furious, but Keanu barely heard it. Because in that moment, as the man took another step forward, as the weight of recognition slammed into him like a freight train, Keanu remembered. This man wasn't here for Shadow. He was here for him. And deep inside, in the places no amount of erased memories could touch, Keanu knew one thing. Whatever happened next, there was no walking away. The air had changed. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was something else. Something sharper. Heavier. Like the weight of a storm before it broke, that moment of eerie stillness before lightning splits the sky. Keanu's breath was slow. Controlled. But inside, his heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his instincts kicking in like an engine roaring to life. The man in the doorway didn't move. Not at first. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly, his presence too deliberate, too calm, as if he had all the time in the world. The hood of his coat cast a shadow over his face, but Keanu didn't need to see his eyes to know that they were locked onto him. Shadow was still growling, deep, guttural, unrelenting. His stance was rigid, muscles tight, his body a live wire of tension. Every hair on his back was raised, his tail low, his claws scraping against the polished floor. Keanu knew that stance. That was a kill stance. Not aggression. Not fear. Pure, trained readiness. And then, the man took a step forward. It was small. Barely anything. Just the slow, measured shift of 1 foot. But it was enough. Enough for the bailiffs to draw their weapons. Enough for the courtroom to stir, murmurs of confusion bubbling under the surface. Enough for Keanu's pulse to spike with something cold and sharp and familiar. This wasn't just a stranger. This was a ghost. The judge slammed his gavel, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. This is a court of law. His voice was loud, firm, but laced with unease. State your name and business immediately, or security will remove you. The man didn't answer. Didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. And then, he smiled again. Slow. Calculated. Like he knew something no one else did. Like he had already won. Relax, the man said, his voice smooth, quiet, too quiet. It shouldn't have carried in a room this large, but somehow, it did. I'm not here to cause trouble. A muscle in Keanu's jaw twitched. That voice. It wasn't just familiar. It was buried. Tucked away in the fractures of a past he wasn't supposed to remember. A voice he had once trusted. A voice that had whispered in his ear on dark nights, in places where shadows moved like ghosts, where orders weren't questioned and mistakes meant death. The room was waiting for something, for the judge to react, for the bailiffs to move. But Keanu had already moved past that. Because he wasn't in a courtroom anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere far away. A memory surfaced, sharp, jarring. A narrow hallway, concrete walls damp with sweat and smoke. The smell of gunpowder in the air. The hum of an earpiece in his ear. Hold the line, Carter. We've got 5 minutes before the handoff. The voice had belonged to him. To this man. Keanu's grip on the leash tightened. You're late, Keanu said, his voice quieter now, colder. The man's smile didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Am I? A flicker of something dangerous passed between them. Unspoken. Unanswered. Shadow barked again, sharp, commanding, breaking through the fog of memories. The man took another step. The bailiffs moved instantly, one raising his weapon, the other stepping forward. Sir, I need you to. The man moved. It was fast. Too fast. 1 second he was standing still, the next, he wasn't. His hand snapped forward, his coat shifting, and suddenly, the bailiff's gun wasn't in his hand anymore. It was in the stranger's. A gasp rippled through the room. No one had even seen how he did it. The other bailiff froze, his weapon still drawn, but his eyes betrayed him. He was rattled. Confused. The man turned the gun in his hand, not aiming it, just holding it. Casually. Like it was his all along. Like it belonged to him. I wouldn't, he said, his voice still calm, still smooth. He tossed the weapon to the floor. Let it slide across the polished wood until it stopped at Keanu's feet. Keanu didn't move. Didn't even glance at it. Because his focus was locked on the man. And the man was still looking right at him. You're not here for shadow, Keanu said, voice steady. So what is this? The man's head tilted again, as if considering the question. A conversation. Is that what we're calling it now? Would you prefer something else? Keanu exhaled through his nose. Everything in him told him to move. To act. To stop waiting for the inevitable. But something was off. This wasn't an attack. Not yet. It was something worse. It was a game. The judge was speaking again, but his words were just noise. The room was fading into the background. It was just Keanu and the man. And then the man's smile faded. Like a mask slipping. Like the illusion was over. You've been running for a long time, the man said, his voice softer now, but heavier. But you knew it would catch up to you eventually. Keanu's jaw tensed. You don't remember everything yet, the man continued. But you will. And when you do, a beat, a pause, a moment that stretched too long. When I do? Keanu asked. The man's eyes darkened. You'll wish you hadn't. The words hung in the air, suspended, thick with meaning. Shadow's growl deepened. And then the alarms went off. Loud. Jarring. Red lights flashing. The room exploded into motion. The bailiffs were shouting. The judge was slamming his gavel. People were standing, confused, panicked. But Keanu wasn't looking at any of them. Because the man was already gone. 1 second he was there. The next, he wasn't. Only the gun remained, resting at Keanu's feet. And in that moment, as the sirens blared and the world tilted into chaos, Keanu knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the beginning. This was the reckoning. The alarm screamed, pulsing through the air like a heartbeat gone wrong. Red lights flashed in harsh, blinding intervals, painting the courtroom in violent shades of crimson. The sharp clang of metal doors locking into place rang out, sealing the exits one by one. Panic rippled through the crowd, shouts, hurried footsteps, the scrape of chairs dragging across the floor as people instinctively scrambled for an escape that didn't exist. But Keanu didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Because the man was gone. Vanished. Like he had never been there at all. Only the gun remained, lying motionless at Keanu's feet, a cold, metallic ghost of the encounter, a silent reminder that whatever had just happened was far from over. Shadow was still locked in place, his body stiff, his head low, teeth bared. He hadn't stopped growling, not even for a second. His instincts hadn't settled. That meant the threat hadn't passed. It had simply moved. Keanu exhaled slowly, his breath measured, his pulse steady, even as the chaos around him grew louder. The judge was yelling for order, the bailiffs were shouting commands, demanding answers, weapons drawn in confusion. But none of it mattered. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. Keanu reached down, fingers brushing the grip of the gun, not picking it up, not yet. Just feeling the weight of it, grounding himself in the moment. His thoughts were already moving ahead, fast, dissecting every second of what had just happened. The man had come here on purpose. Not to kill him. Not to fight. To remind him. You don't remember everything yet, but you will. Keanu clenched his jaw. The words still clung to him, digging their hooks in deeper with every passing second. Because he did remember. Not all of it. Not enough. But the shape of it was there, shifting in the fog of his mind, fragments trying to pull themselves back together. A mission. A name. A choice. Something they had taken from him. And now, it was coming back. The judge slammed his gavel, the sharp crack slicing through the noise. Lock this building down. His voice was shaking now, no longer the neutral authority of a man in control, but the desperate command of someone who had just realized he was no longer the one in charge. Nobody leaves until we. The lights cut out. Instant. Complete. The courtroom plunged into darkness. For a single breath, everything was still. Then, gunfire. Not in the room, but close. Somewhere in the building. Sharp, controlled bursts, military precision. Not random. Not a panic. A strategy. Keanu reacted before the first scream had even started. Move. His voice snapped through the air, his instincts taking over as he yanked Shadow's leash, shifting into motion. A second later, the first explosion hit. The floor shook, the walls trembled, and the distant echo of shattered glass spilled into the courtroom like a warning. Someone screamed. The bailiffs were barking orders now, but Keanu wasn't listening. He was already analyzing. Whoever had just hit the building wasn't here for the judge. Wasn't here for the case. They were here for him. And they weren't waiting anymore. Shadow was already pulling forward, his instincts locked onto the only thing that mattered: an escape. Keanu pivoted sharply, moving without hesitation toward the nearest side door, his mind already mapping out the layout of the courthouse from memory. He had studied it before the trial. Checked every entry, every exit. He wasn't careless. He had known, somewhere deep down, he had known this wasn't over. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the room in a sickly, dim glow. A bailiff moved to block Keanu's path, gun raised. "Stop right there." His voice was tight, edged with nerves. "Nobody leaves until we secure the building." Keanu didn't slow. Didn't stop. "You're out of time." His voice was even, but there was no room for argument. "You can either stop me, or you can deal with whoever just came through those doors." A beat of hesitation. The kind that only lasted half a second, but in a fight, half a second was a lifetime. Keanu took it. His body moved fast, precise, a single, fluid motion. A shift of weight, a pivot of his heel, and the bailiff was on the floor, his own weapon stripped from his grip before he even knew it was happening. Keanu didn't keep the gun. Just disarmed him, redirected him. By the time the bailiff hit the ground, Keanu was already gone. Shadow was at his side, a blur of controlled motion, weaving through the chaos with the kind of lethal grace only a trained military dog could possess. Then, the second explosion. It wasn't inside the courtroom. It was outside. Keanu felt it before he heard it, the shift in air pressure, the vibration underfoot. A tactical blast, not enough to bring the structure down, but enough to block exits, reroute movement, force everyone exactly where they wanted them. They were hurting him. His stomach twisted. This wasn't an escape. It was a trap. And the only way out was through it. He hit the stairwell door, shoving it open just as the next round of gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets slammed into the walls, splintering wood, shattering glass. They weren't aiming for the crowd. They were aiming for him. Keanu moved fast, taking the stairs two at a time, Shadow never leaving his side. His mind was already spinning ahead, calculating. If they were pushing him toward an exit, then that meant they were already covering the perimeter. That meant rooftop. It was the only viable option. No way out at ground level. No time to fight through. The only shot he had was to go up. To get above them. The next landing came fast. He hit the door, slamming it open, and stopped. Because there, standing in the middle of the hallway, waiting like he had all the time in the world, was the man. Not one of the gunmen. Not just another soldier. The man from the courtroom. The one who had smiled. The one who had disappeared. And now, he was waiting. Keanu exhaled slowly. Shadow didn't bark this time. Didn't growl. Just stared. Because they both knew this was the moment. The man smiled again, tilting his head just slightly. "You figured it out faster than I thought," he said. Keanu's grip on Shadow's leash tightened. "Figured out what?" The man stepped forward, slow, measured. His eyes gleamed under the dim emergency lights. "That this isn't about Shadow." A beat. A pause. A realization settling into Keanu's chest like a weight. The man's smile deepened. "This is about you." The words landed hard. Cold. Like a key turning in a lock. And then the lights cut out again. A door slammed shut. And everything plunged into darkness. The darkness swallowed everything. Thick. Absolute. A black void that stretched out in every direction, turning the hallway into a suffocating abyss. The power had been cut again, but this time, it wasn't just the courtroom. It was everything. Keanu didn't move. Didn't breathe. Listened. His heart was steady. His body still. The years of training, of surviving in places where the shadows held death, had carved an instinct into him that wasn't human anymore. It was something deeper. Something honed. And right now, that instinct told him one thing. He wasn't alone. Shadow was motionless at his side, his breath even, his ears twitching in the pitch-black air. Not growling. Not barking. But his muscles were taut, his body coiled. Waiting. Anticipating. Keanu tightened his grip on the leash, his fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve. Inside, just at his wrist, was a knife, small, sharp, and silent. A weapon that didn't need light to be deadly. The air in the hallway shifted. Not a sound. Not a breath. A presence. Keanu's muscles tensed. Then a footstep. Quiet. Almost imperceptible. But not to him. Not in the void. Keanu pivoted fast. The blade was in his hand before the movement was complete, the sharp edge flashing as he lashed out in the dark, but it never landed. Because the man was already moving. A shadow inside the shadow. A ghost that had learned to disappear before the world even knew he existed. Keanu felt the air shift again, close now, too close. He didn't hesitate. He struck again, body twisting with precision, the blade slicing through the air toward where he knew the man should be. And then, a hand caught his wrist. Fast. Unnaturally fast. A grip like steel locked around his forearm, stopping the knife mid-swing. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, a voice. Low. Amused. Still fast, the man murmured. That's good. Keanu's teeth clenched. Then he moved. A shift of weight. A redirection of force. The grip on his wrist was tight, but not tight enough. He turned into the hold instead of pulling away, twisting the man's own momentum against him. The grip broke, barely. Keanu lashed out again, no hesitation, his elbow snapping up toward the man's ribs, aiming for damage. But the strike never landed. Because the man wasn't there anymore. Keanu exhaled through his nose, steady, forcing his pulse to slow. The presence was still there, somewhere in the dark. He could feel it. You remember, don't you? The voice came again. Not everything. Not yet. But it's coming back, isn't it? Keanu ignored the words. Didn't take the bait. Because he did remember. Not all of it. Not the whole picture. But the shape of it. The edges of something sharp, something that had been buried deep inside him, locked away under layers of something they had built into him. And now, it was bleeding through. Footsteps echoed down the hall, not the man's. Others. The soldiers. The ones who had orchestrated this. Keanu turned sharply, pressing a hand to Shadow's side, a silent command. The dog moved instantly, falling in line, ready. They were out of time. The man had stalled him long enough for the others to arrive. And now, they were coming to finish it. Keanu inhaled slowly, steadying himself. The darkness was still absolute, but it didn't matter anymore. He knew what he had to do. Then, the emergency lights flickered back on. Dim, flickering. A dull, washed-out yellow that bathed the hallway in a sickly glow. The world snapped back into focus. And standing at the other end of the hall was the man. Completely still. Completely untouched. Like he had never moved at all. Keanu's grip on the knife tightened. His breath was calm, measured, but his body was ready. The man tilted his head slightly, watching him. You can still walk away from this, he said. You don't have to do this now. Keanu stared at him. And then, he smiled. A slow, humorless smile. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? This had already started. And there was no walking away. Yeah, Keanu murmured, his voice quiet but firm. I do. The man exhaled through his nose, something almost like a laugh. And then, the soldiers reached the stairwell. Heavy boots. The sound of weapons being readied. The shifting of tactical gear. They were here. Keanu didn't hesitate. Didn't waste time with words. He moved. Fast. Shadow was already lunging, his body a blur of controlled fury, his instincts locked onto the threat before it could fully materialize. Keanu was right behind him, his body falling into motion as the gunfire erupted. And just like that, the fight began. The gunfire was deafening, each shot slicing through the air like a blade, the sharp percussion of violence reverberating through the narrow hallway. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the stale air of the courthouse, thick and suffocating. Keanu moved without thinking. Not because he had no plan, but because his body had already made the decision before his mind had time to process it. Shadow lunged first. A blur of muscle and instinct, his teeth flashing as he took down the first soldier before the man had time to react. The scream was quick, cut off by the impact, the sheer force of trained aggression sending the body sprawling to the floor. The man's weapon clattered against the tile, sliding uselessly out of reach. Keanu was already twisting before the next shot came. He dropped low, his shoulder brushing against the cool floor as the bullet barely missed him, slicing through the empty space where his head had been a second earlier. Too close. Too damn close. He rolled, shifting his weight, his muscles coiling like a spring, and then he was up again. The knife in his hand was an extension of himself. He barely remembered drawing it, but it was there, gripped tight between his fingers, the familiar weight grounding him. He moved fast, stepping into the blind spot of the nearest soldier, his blade slashing clean across the man's forearm. A sharp cry. A gun dropping. Blood splattering onto the tile. One less weapon to worry about. There was no time to hesitate. Another soldier turned toward him, rifle raised, the muzzle flashing in the dim emergency lighting. Keanu grabbed the nearest body, didn't matter if the man was dead or unconscious, and used it as a shield. The bullet struck flesh, the impact vibrating through the deadweight in his arms, but Keanu was already moving again, already throwing the lifeless body aside and closing the distance between him and the next target. Another strike. A knife burying itself in a throat. A body collapsing. He barely heard the gunshot that followed. His focus was singular on movement, on survival, on the cold, precise mechanics of the kill. Shadow was still at his side, his breath heavy, his fur streaked with blood that wasn't his own. His body was low to the ground, his muscles still tight, his stance that of a predator waiting for the next attack. Then, silence. A thick, suffocating stillness settled over the hallway, broken only by the ragged breaths of the dying and the faint echo of a distant alarm still blaring through the courthouse. The air reeked of sweat, of blood, of death. Keanu exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the knife. The fight was over. But the war wasn't. His eyes flicked toward the far end of the hallway, where the dim light barely illuminated a lone figure standing in the shadows. Untouched. Unshaken. Unbothered. The man. The one who had walked into the courtroom. The one who had spoken in riddles and disappeared into the darkness before the first shot had even been fired. He was still there. Watching. Waiting. Keanu wiped the blood from his blade on the sleeve of a fallen soldier before straightening, his breath finally slowing, steadying. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than words. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That was impressive," he murmured, his voice disturbingly calm, as if they weren't standing in the middle of a massacre. As if the floor wasn't littered with the bodies of men who had come here to kill Keanu and had failed. Keanu said nothing. The man took a slow step forward. Not a threat. Not an attack. Something worse. A test. "You haven't lost it," the man continued, his tone almost conversational. "Your reflexes. Your instincts. They tried to bury them, didn't they? Try to make you forget who you really are." Keanu's jaw tensed. The man exhaled, almost like a sigh. But they failed. Keanu finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but steady. You're stalling. The man's lips curled slightly, not a smile, but something close. Maybe. Then, he moved. Fast. Too fast. Keanu reacted instantly, his body shifting into action before his mind had even fully processed the movement. His knife lashed out, the strike clean, precise, aimed for the kill. And then. The man didn't dodge. He didn't flinch. He let the knife land. The blade buried itself into his side, the steel sinking deep into flesh, cutting through fabric, muscle, bone. Keanu felt the impact, the resistance, but something was wrong. The reaction never came. No stagger. No gasp. No look of pain. The man just stood there. Still. Silent. And then, he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. Keanu's blood turned to ice. The man lifted his hand, his fingers curling around Keanu's wrist, gripping it with an unnatural strength. Too strong. Keanu's muscles tensed. He tried to pull away. He couldn't. The man leaned in slightly, his breath warm against Keanu's ear, his voice barely above a whisper. You were supposed to be with us, Carter. The words slammed into him. Carter. Not Keanu. Carter. His breath hitched. His mind fractured. And then. The memories came flooding back. Not in pieces. Not in fragments. All at once. The mission. The war. The orders. The betrayal. The choice. Nathan Carter. That was his name. Not Keanu. Not Reeves. Nathan. And in that instant, as the truth crashed into him like a tidal wave, as the world around him blurred into something unrecognizable. Keanu Nathan Carter remembered everything. The past had finally caught up to him. Not as a whisper. Not as a distant memory clawing its way back into his mind. It came like a storm, violent, inescapable, and absolute. Nathan Carter. Not Keanu. Not Reeves. Nathan. And now, with the name came the weight of everything he had spent years trying to forget. The war. The missions. The betrayal. The man still stood there, unmoving, the fresh wound on his side barely registering in his expression. He had let the knife sink into him like it was nothing, like it didn't matter. Because maybe it didn't. You know how this ends, Carter, the man said, his voice even, like he had already written the conclusion to this story, like all of this had been inevitable. Nathan inhaled slowly, his mind calculating, dissecting the situation like he used to do, like he had been trained to do. Options. Exits. Weaknesses. The stairwell was no longer an option. The soldiers were closing in from both sides. His body was ready for a fight. His mind was screaming for an escape. But something deeper, something buried even beneath the memories that had just resurfaced, it whispered something else. Maybe this wasn't about running. Maybe it never had been. His grip on Shadow's leash tightened. The dog was silent, his body rigid, his instincts mirroring Nathan's own, waiting, calculating, sensing the shift in the air. This wasn't a fight they could win. Not like this. Not here. Nathan turned slightly, just enough to meet the man's eyes. Still watching. Still waiting. Say it, Nathan murmured, his voice low, edged with something sharp. The man exhaled slowly, his lips curling into something almost like a smirk. You were one of us, he said, until you weren't. The words landed like a final puzzle piece snapping into place. Nathan knew what they meant. He knew what had been taken from him. What had been done to him. And worse, what he had once been willing to do. A choice. A mission. A moment in time that had altered the trajectory of his entire life. He didn't need the details to know that whatever it was the reason they wanted him back. Or dead. The sound of boots on metal echoed up the stairwell. Closer. They were running out of time. Nathan glanced toward the rooftop door. The final exit. He could make it. If he moved now. Or he could stay. Face it. Let the past finally catch up. The man saw the hesitation flicker in his eyes, and for the first time, something changed in his expression. Approval? Recognition? It didn't matter. Because in the end, Nathan made his choice. He turned toward the rooftop, toward the open air, toward whatever was waiting for him beyond this moment. He didn't run, not this time. But he didn't stay, either. Shadow followed, never hesitating, never questioning. The last thing Nathan heard before the door slammed shut behind him was the man's voice, soft, amused, and just a little too certain. You'll come back. Nathan didn't stop. Didn't turn. Didn't answer. Maybe the man was right. Maybe not. Either way, the past wasn't finished with him. Not yet. And just like that, he disappeared into the night.